All right, boys and girls, let's pick up our Flat Stanley adventure on Chapter 2. Chapter 2, Being Flat. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He would go in and out of rooms, even when the door was closed, just lying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous, and he tried to slide under a door, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley had found. He was taking a walk with his mom, Mrs. Lambchop, one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating that covered a deep, dark shaft. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I have an idea," Stanley said. He took a pair of laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket, and he tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied one end of that to the back of his belt, and he gave the other end to his mother. Look what he did. "Lower me," he said, "and I will look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down and from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding a long lace that ran down through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. "What's the matter, lady?" the first police officer asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I am not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second police officer. "We caught a cuckoo here," saying she's crazy, right? Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned angrily at the police officer. "A cuckoo indeed," she said. "Shame!" The police officer apologized. "We didn't get it, lady," they said. "We have been hasty. We see that now." "People should think twice before making rude remarks," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and then not make those comments at all." The police officer realized that was a good idea and a good rule and said they would try to remember it. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had recently moved to California. A school vacation was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mrs. Lambchop sighed. "A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California is very expensive," she said. "I will have to think of a cheaper way." When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try this on for size." The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over. Mrs. Lambchop had discovered this. There was room for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a toothpaste case filled with milk. They had to put a great deal of many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and the insurance, but it was still much less expensive than a train or an airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into the envelope, along with his egg salad sandwich and a toothbrush case full of milk, and he mailed him from the mailbox on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was very limber, or flexible boy, and inside the box, he straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home or alone before. She rapped the box. "Could you hear me, dear?" she she called. Are you all right? Stanley's voice came quite clearly. I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now? Wait an hour and try not to overheat, dear, said Mrs. Lambchop. Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, goodbye, goodbye, and they went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope that they had made themselves. It had red and black markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it valuable and fragile, and this end up on both sides. Back home, Stanley told his family that he had been handled so carefully he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lambchop said it proved that jet planes are wonderful, and so was the Postal Service, and that this was a great age in which they lived. Stanley thought so too. I hope you enjoyed a couple of Stanley's adventures.